welcome to everybody. I wanted to make just a few announcements, and I'm going to do this really very quickly. I feel always kind of embarrassed about making these announcements because the really important person is sitting right over there, and you all, but I do have to make a few announcements anyway. First of all, we need some volunteers to help us with the work of the Windham World Affairs Council. And we especially need people who have capabilities that would allow them to help us with public relations. So if you would be interested in working with us on programming and public relations type activities, please speak to me or any one of the board people who are here tonight, because we are looking for support, and we would value any contribution that any of you feel that you can make. It's my pleasure to introduce Stanley Sloan, founding director of the Atlantic Community Initiative. Mr. Sloan has logged in more than 5 decades of public service, beginning at the Central Intelligence Agency in 1967, serving there as NATO and European Community Desk Officer, member of the U.S. delegation to negotiations on mutual and balanced force reductions, and is Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Western Europe. In the time I have, I can't possibly represent his many prolific years of teaching, writing, and representing our country. But bringing us closer to the present, Mr. Sloan is one of America's top experts on U.S.-European relationship. His most recent book is on NATO and the transatlantic bargain from Truman to Obama. And you will see at the back, I just put it up, flyers that look something like this, although his are in color. And we will give these to you on the way out so that you can see the kind of reviews this book has gotten. But I would like to read to you from just one of the reviews so that you can get an idea of what happens in this book. Stanley Sloan, and this is, I'm quoting now from the Office of the Secretary General of NATO. Stanley Sloan has for many years been one of the most influential and authoritative analysts of the NATO alliance. In his new book, he demonstrates once again his in-depth knowledge of NATO issues and his sound, balanced judgments of both the strengths and weaknesses of the alliance as it strives to adapt to the 21st century challenges. This book should be at the top of the list for anyone who wants to understand today's NATO. Sounds good, right? Mr. Sloan comes to us most recently from Middlebury College, where he is a visiting scholar at the Rowayton College for International Affairs. He lives in Vermont and is, I understand, a member also of the Red Sox Nation. You were listening. He will speak on NATO, necessary but not sufficient. Please welcome Stanley Sloan.
Now, hopefully you won't feel in the dark when we finish. So, Margot, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thanks to the Windham World Affairs Council of Vermont. As a native Vermonter, I'm always pleased to say the word Vermont. I went away to Washington for quite a few years and never left Vermont, and I'm happy to be living back here again for the last decade. The dinner, the lovely dinner that we had before this session ended with fortune cookies, and of course I, with some reluctance, cracked open my fortune cookie, and it said that you are an exciting and inspiring person. And I thought that's a very high hurdle to set for tonight. So hopefully I can at least make it interesting. I'll go to that level of performance. I've already had one question from the audience, and the question is, what is this Atlantic Community Initiative? And perhaps because it has a website, it looks like more than it actually is. The Atlantic Community Initiative is basically Stan Sloan. But the purpose of the initiative and the purpose of the website is to try to promote learning, education, knowledge about the U.S.-European relationship, and particularly about the relationship between the process of maintaining the Atlantic community, of which NATO is the keystone, and also the process of developing European integration, and making those two processes compatible which has not always been easy. It's not been easy in recent years, and it certainly wasn't easy in the distant past. So that's what the Atlantic Community Initiative is. It's basically a way for me to get a message out and to post some of my writings online. And at the end of the lecture, you'll see the URL for a reference point. I'm also reminded when I'm introduced as someone who's done a lot of work on the subject, what Carl Sandburg said was the definition of an expert. Anybody know that Carl Sandburg definition? Sandburg said that an expert is just another damn fool a long ways from home. Of course, I can't claim that now because I'm not that far from home. I live in Richmond, Vermont, and I was born and raised in Montpelier, so I feel that I really am at home and very comfortable being here with all of you. But we'll be talking about NATO, and because I teach, I understand that it's important to involve history in any discussion of any subject, but particularly in discussion where a lot of people haven't necessarily paid attention or had a focus on the history of this organization. And so I will start with a discussion of some history. But first, a little bit of political cartoons. These three political cartoons that I'm going to show at the beginning illustrate the difficult times that the Alliance has had in recent years. Here you see two players on the NATO soccer team, the United States and Europe. And this was during the Iraq conflict in the early stages when there were great differences between the United States and Europe. And you can see the coach talking to one of the officials, and he's saying they'd be a good team if they spent more time kicking the ball and less time kicking each other. So that was the Iraq conflict. Afghanistan. Here is a representation of the way the Canadians felt about their role in Afghanistan when they were on the front lines with the United States and a few other countries, the British. And Canadians felt that the way the soldier felt, apparently. He says, "Cover me, guys." And then he realizes that there's only cardboard cutouts behind him, that he is basically alone facing going into conflict. So the casualty differential became a huge issue in Afghanistan. It's a little bit less of one now, but it is still a major issue. A lot of allies have taken more risks than have others. The United States, obviously, the British, and for a while the Canadians were in the center of it. Although today, given the Canadian pullback from conflict, the Canadians now are like those cardboard cutout figures more than the active combat. And now, of course, the most recent ones, I love this cartoon, just spotted this the other day. Here you see President Obama and a figure representing NATO, and they're tossing the Libya bombshell back and forth. And they say this is why they call it multilateral diplomacy. NATO has come in for a good bit of editorial cartoon criticism in recent years, but I'm going to hopefully give you a message about why it is still a very important thing to pay attention to. And my argument will be that NATO's basic foundation is still very solid. It's based on good, solid values. It is still relevant to the security interests of the member states, and it's very adaptable. The transatlantic bargain, I use that term. I borrowed it from a former Perm Rep to NATO who wrote a book in the 1960s using that term. I have developed it in my books over the last 20 years, actually. And this bargain between the United States and Europe has survived a lot of very difficult times between the United States and Europe. Different philosophies about what the alliance should be, different attitudes toward who should be contributing what, different roles in the world, a lot of burden-sharing issues over all that time. But in the past decade, it's been even more difficult than it was perhaps at any point during the Cold War. We've had the differences over, I suppose, unilateral U.S. actions even before Iraq came along, differences over Iraq, differences over how to react to 9/11. NATO's mission in Afghanistan has caused a lot of divisions among the allies, and not just between the United States and European countries, but among European countries themselves. Relations with Russia still is a very controversial topic inside the alliance, and now the intervention in Libya causes more problems. The Allies celebrated the 60th anniversary of the alliance 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, And then last year, in November, they agreed on what's called a new strategic concept. The alliance had last come up with a concept in 1999. This was the most recent one. I'll talk a little bit about what that said. And finally, what I will say will be that NATO is still, as in the title of my talk, necessary, but it's not sufficient, because we need more and better ways of coordinating the non-military aspects of security, the non-military aspects of statecraft that can go into dealing with crisis situations in the future. And we need to do this on a multilateral basis. So, that's what I'm going to tell you. I always argue when I lecture at the NATO College in Rome frequently, and I always tell my audiences there that if they haven't looked at the North Atlantic Treaty recently, they should go back and read it. It's an elegant document, very straightforward and very short, but it's very important, because I think that the North Atlantic Treaty is remarkably relevant to the interests of the United States, Canada, and the European allies. The preamble lists values that I think we all could sign on to today, if this were a treaty written today. Most importantly, founded on the principles of individual liberty, democracy, and the rule of law. We still believe in all of that. We don't necessarily always live up to the standards most effectively, but that still is something that unites the United States, Canada, and the European allies. Article 2, which is known as, actually, is the Canadian article, because Canadians in 1949 insisted that the treaty have this kind of an aspect, called for promoting international cooperation, removal of frictions, economic and political, among the allies and between the allies and the rest of the world. Now, the article that is best known about NATO is Article 5. That's a mutual defense commitment. And in the treaty, the allies agree that if one ally is attacked, every other ally will regard it as an attack on them. Doesn't guarantee what they'll do. No one is committed to doing any one thing particularly, but it does guarantee that they'll treat it as an attack on themselves, even though it was an attack on another ally. An article that really wasn't too relevant during the Cold War has become much more relevant in the post-Cold War period. And that's Article 4, which pledges cooperation to deal with threats to territorial integrity, political independence, or security. If you'll notice, the difference here is that the Article 5 talks about an attack. Article 5, the mutual defense commitment, only has to do with an attack on an ally, whereas Article 4 talks about dealing with threats. Well, in these days, we're mainly dealing with threats rather than dealing with attacks by another government on one of the governments of the alliance. So this has become, Article 4 has become much more important, and something really interesting happened to the relationship between Article 4 and Article 5 in this new strategic concept last year. Again, a little bit on the historical side. The original bargain between the United States and Europe, I argue, has two different elements. One part is the economic element. The Marshall Plan was at the heart of this part of the bargain. The United States said to the European countries, we're going to give you all of this assistance if you'll organize yourselves to use that assistance most effectively. When I made that point one time at the NATO College, a French officer up in the back, I remember this vividly, said, well, there's a French scholar who says that what the United States did was simply self-interested, because the United States wanted the markets in Europe, wanted to have access to productive markets, and therefore it was the United States, what the United States did was totally self-interested. And I agreed with him that in fact it was self-interested. But I also asked him if he knew of any other case in history when a country that had won a war actually was as generous to the countries it had defeated and the countries that had suffered during the war. And I don't think any, I've asked that question several times to audiences in Europe. No one has come up with an answer that any other victor had ever been as generous as the United States was. Sure, there was a self-interested component, no doubt about it, but it was also incredibly generous and helpful to Europe. The other part of this bargain had a similar premise, and that is Europeans organizing to use the assistance from the United States, but this was on the political military side, where the U.S. promised to help defend Europe if the Europeans would organize to help defend themselves. So those were the two parts of the bargain A lot of Europeans don't recognize it as a bargain because bargain is not a word that translates nicely into any European language. It's a very American concept. But it still, I think, is an important way of representing the way that we in the United States see this relationship. And particularly the people I worked for 25 years in the Congress see it as a bargain where the Europeans have to hold up their side of the deal. Now, the economic bargain was an incredible success, and here are just the historical evolution of this basic principle. We provided the Marshall Plan assistance. The Europeans created the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, and that gave birth to the process of community building in Europe that eventually led to the Treaty of Maastricht in 1991 to the European Union. But this is not to diminish the importance of those leaders in Europe who led this process of integration. But the fact is that without the assistance from the United States in the late 40s and early 50s, this process would have had a hard time getting underway. Unfortunately, the military bargain wasn't nearly so successful. We, the Americans, put pressure on the French to come up with a plan for organizing European security. They came up with a plan for the European defense community. The treaty was signed in 1952, but in 1954 the proposal failed in the French National Assembly. There are lots of interesting stories about why it failed, why the French ended up voting against it. But in the end, the treaties of Bonn and Paris were negotiated, which put together the relationship between the United States and Europe and provided for European monitoring of German rearmament. So it gave the French some control over Germany's rearmament. But one of the factors in that fascinating story was, in fact, the attitude of Moscow toward all of this as transmitted through the French Communist Party. This is a poster that the French Communist Party put all over France when the treaties of Bonn and Paris were being considered. And as you can see, they were trying to raise the level of concern in France about German rearmament and how it could lead to the Wehrmacht being reconstituted in Germany. Well, fortunately, they were unsuccessful, and in fact, the arrangements that would end up with Germany coming into the alliance and Germany being controlled through these treaty arrangements succeeded. And what we ended up with was what I call a revised bargain. It wasn't the bargain that the U.S. Congress certainly expected from the very beginning. It was a different bargain because it ended up putting very heavy reliance on U.S. nuclear threat against the Soviet Union. And it also, therefore, produced a very heavy reliance on the presence of American forces in Europe. And so the alliance didn't produce the kind of dynamic that members of the U.S. Congress, when they voted for the North Atlantic Treaty, we didn't get the alliance that they thought they were going to get. Ended up with a very different bargain. Now, the good news was that this bargain actually resulted in a lot of good things over the long run. It deterred the Soviet Union, and you could say it ended up with the NATO countries winning the Cold War. But the bad news is that it encouraged what I call a permanent burden-sharing complaint. The complaint obviously was from the United States, directed at the Europeans. And it led to what I've also called the defense dependence culture in Europe. The defense dependence culture was one in which Europeans basically did enough to keep the United States committed to the alliance, but not enough to create a separate European option, to create a sufficiently strong European defense capability, fearing that if they did that, the United States would then pull out. They didn't want the United States to pull out. And another side effect, of course, was that even though the Europeans in many ways made these choices, it created huge resentment of their dependence on the United States. And that's one of the factors that is perhaps not as lively in today's debate, but is still there in the background of all the discussions about NATO commitments and NATO missions. Over the period from 1949 until 2011, NATO has been many, many things. And NATO is very often described as a defense alliance or a political military alliance. I would argue that it really is a lot of things, and it's more than that. I would argue first that NATO is a community of values as represented by the North Atlantic Treaty. Secondly, I would argue that it is a broad and flexible framework. It has been sufficiently flexible to accommodate a lot of different approaches to dealing first with the Soviet Union and then after the end of the Cold War to reflect the needs of the new security environment. And very importantly, both of these points, one of the things the North Atlantic Treaty does is honor the sovereignty of the members. Now that's, I suppose, both good and bad. It's good because every country feels that it has its own sovereign choice to make, from the smallest country in the alliance to the largest. Every country has to go along with the decision because NATO operates by consensus. The bad part, I guess, is that sometimes it makes decision-making very slow, and sometimes decision-making becomes impossible. The commitment in Article 5 is obviously the heart of the alliance, a collective defense commitment that I've talked about. But NATO also, something that is underestimated, is that NATO is a cooperative defense organization. And what do I mean by cooperative defense organization? I mean that on the day-to-day basis, our militaries work with each other, our diplomats work with each other. They've developed over the years a set of standards, called NATO standards, on which Allied forces operate. And there is just simply the day-to-day habits of cooperation that are developed as a result of this alliance make a lot of things possible that people assume would be there anyway. For example, when the George Bush administration came to office, you'll probably remember Don Rumsfeld after 9/11 said that basically a coalition of countries we'll depend on will be the ones that we choose rather than any existing coalition. It was a put down of NATO in many ways. But the fact is that you cannot have an ad hoc coalition that will be successful militarily if they haven't been working together and practicing together over time. It is unacceptable to put military forces out side by side on a battlefield if they haven't been working with each other, because the dangers to the forces would be even more important than their inability to deal with the enemy. So even for ad hoc coalitions, the cooperative defense relationship that is fostered and maintained by NATO is something that is critically important, even when you operate as an ad hoc coalition. The alliance is also a tool. It can promote burden sharing or it can facilitate burden shifting. Over the years, it has been best known in many ways as a way for allies to shift the burden, particularly to the United States, and spend less on their own defense budgets than we would like them to spend. Although the fact that we have the alliance has allowed the United States to put pressure on the European allies to try to improve the burden-sharing relationship. You might think about the most recent case of Libya, where in fact the United States has attempted to shift the burden through NATO to the European allies, the United States taking a smaller, albeit very important, continuing role in the Libya operation. In fact, President Obama tried to use NATO as a way of shifting some of the responsibility and the burdens to the European allies. How successful that will be, we'll have to wait and see. The alliance in the post-Cold War period has become a source of policy options for crisis management. Again, Libya provides a case in contemporary point. NATO is an open and transparent organization. I know when the former Warsaw Pact countries started sending military officers to the NATO college, how stunned they were by the discussions among officers at the college and by all the information that was provided in the briefings. They couldn't believe that all of this stuff was going to be discussed openly among these military officers from NATO countries. But in fact, it is true, and in some ways it's a problem because NATO has a hard time keeping secrets. But on the other hand, that is the nature of an alliance among democracies. It is an open and transparent organization. One thing that I don't think anyone anticipated NATO would be during the Cold War is an instrument to promote democratic political change. But indeed, after the end of the Cold War, so many, virtually all of the former Warsaw Pact members, other than Russia, and many of the former Soviet republics that wanted to become part of the West, they wanted to join NATO right away. I can remember in the early 1990s lecturing at the NATO college and having Polish officers getting up and saying, we need to get into NATO. And NATO wasn't ready to take this on. But when NATO got ready to take it on in the mid-1990s, it laid out a number of criteria that countries would have to meet in order to be accepted into the alliance. They had to have democratic systems. They had to have free market systems. They had to resolve issues with their neighbors. They had to resolve issues with minorities. And NATO laid out a whole list, long list, of things that countries had to do if they wanted to become part of the alliance. The European Union ended up doing the same things in a sequence, basically, for many of these countries. But it provided, because these countries desperately wanted to get away from Russia and get into the Western world, it provided a lot of incentive for them to create democratic political systems in their country to resolve problems with their neighbors and so forth. Perhaps this is also a mixed blessing. NATO has become both the key symbol and the key instrument of transatlantic cooperation. It is a problem perhaps because it carries a huge burden. The transatlantic relationship is more than just NATO. But NATO has become a symbol, and it's hard to make changes to what that symbol means without changing people's perceptions of the whole relationship. And so it makes it very difficult to make some changes that would make perhaps a lot of sense in the alliance without creating the image that Europe's no longer committed or the United States is no longer committed. So the symbolic importance of NATO is in some ways a problem. And I would argue that the transatlantic alliance more broadly is a critical part of international stability. And this goes beyond NATO. This is basically the argument that the transatlantic alliance and the cooperation that goes on among countries, all of the NATO and EU countries, this provides a core of stability in the international system. And if you think about it, very little works in the United Nations unless these countries are agreed that it should work. And so this core of stability is critically important. If you tore that apart, you would also make cooperation in the United Nations much more difficult. Now, getting to more recent crises in the alliance, I would argue that even before George Bush came to office, there was a problem developing in the alliance, and some of the things the George Bush administration, the first term, did reflected their attitudes growing out of the reality that Europe had really, in the 1990s, not taken advantage of the opportunity to make changes to their military forces to make them more relevant to the kinds of security challenges that we were going to face in the future. Border defense was the main focus of everything that Germany did during the Cold War. That was exactly what we wanted them to do. That's what they wanted to do. But it was true for other countries as well. Only a couple of countries maintained the ability for force projection, the UK and France being the leading among those. But most of them focused on border defense. And so when we started dealing with challenges beyond Europe's borders, it became very difficult for European countries to make contributions to those efforts. This led to diminishing U.S. confidence in the alliance and the ability of the allies to be helpful. And I had enough conversations with some key people who went into the Bush administration before they went in to know how strongly they felt that this was the key problem and that they couldn't rely on NATO. And so I wasn't surprised when Rumsfeld said what he said about the coalition that they would rely on would not necessarily be an established coalition. There was a bad problem already developing in the alliance, and it was leading to this kind of a perception that the United States in the future would do the fighting, that Europe would provide finance and would put out peacekeepers, and that the United Nations would do the humanitarian assistance. And this is how the international system was going to work in the future. I always had problems about this division of labor, and the reason was that if we took one responsibility and the Europeans took another totally different responsibility, we would end up interpreting every international crisis and event in very different ways. Instead of sharing responsibilities when we would understand that we both had military and non-military roles to play in the international system. And this is a great cartoon that again captures both European and American attitudes at that time. You see Uncle Sam coming out of the bad guy's bar, beating up on everybody in the bad guy's bar, obviously. And he sees Europe coming down the street. You see Europe slouching with a mop and a bucket. And Uncle Sam says, "Oh, there you are, just in time to clean up." And that was basically during the Iraq campaign. That was the way a lot of Americans looked at Europe. You know, we're doing the fighting, we're doing the hard stuff, and here Europe is doing the easy stuff. Whereas in Europe, they were looking at it in many ways the same facts, but from their point of view, the United States goes in, makes a mess, and they end up having to clean it up. So it was, this cartoon I thought was brilliant from that point of view. It captured both the American and the European attitudes about the way the relationship was developing. But there were, I think, serious consequences had we continued to go in this direction. Serious consequences for the relationship. Because as I've already suggested, if we have diverging perspectives on international problems and solutions, we would end up going down different roads in the future. We would end up with an issue-based international alignment of convenience, not of commitment. The North Atlantic Treaty is an alliance of commitments that are made by allies to other allies. And we were headed toward this ad hoc structure in which it would be convenient sometimes to cooperate, not convenient sometimes to cooperate, but there wouldn't be any continuing commitment. And I think if we had gone down that road, we would have seen ourselves headed back toward a balance of power system that in the 19th century I don't think worked all that well. And sometimes when Europeans in the 2010s talked about the benefits of Europe constituting an autonomous pole in the international system, I sometimes would remind them that if they wanted a system like that, where Europe could line up with, let's say, with China or with Russia or with both of them against us, that such a system would also allow the United States to line up with China or Russia against Europe. And while maybe they liked the idea of being able to line up against the U.S. with China and Russia, they didn't really like the idea of us lining up with anybody else against them. So I think that in the end, everybody saw that this wouldn't make a lot of sense. It probably would have led to the end of the alliance and increased international instability. Now, again, great political cartoons came out of the differences over this, and the first one, drawn by a Turkish cartoonist, shows Uncle Sam shooting off the Iraq bullet that goes through the UN, the European Union, NATO, Turkey, and then misses Saddam Hussein. And that was, of course, before Saddam Hussein had been captured. And there was a U.S. view as well. Not every American would have taken this view, but here you see George Bush saying France and Germany are behind us, unfortunately. You can see the daggers of Bush's back. A lot of different ways of looking at that crisis. And there always are different perspectives on this relationship between the United States and its European allies. But what are the lessons that we should have learned, and I think to some extent have learned coming out of this Iraq experience? The first thing, I think, and the most important one perhaps, the United States, I believe, had to learn how to be a hegemon without acting like one. Well, what do I mean by that? A hegemon, as you know, is a country that has excessive influence over the affairs and decisions of other states. In some ways, we are still that hegemon. But we have to learn how not to act like one. Because, as Teddy Roosevelt said, you know, speak softly, carry a big stick. Well, we were many times during the Bush administration, we were speaking loudly and carrying a big stick. And that obviously had negative consequences for U.S. interests. The United States, I think, can dominate most military conflicts, at least on individual battlefields, but we really need cooperation from allies, from international organizations, to not only win the peace, but also to legitimize the use of force. If we can't get a lot of allies involved, then perhaps our use of force is not legitimate. So it's an important element of the American use of force. And I would argue, for all the reasons that I've already laid out on the table, that the United States needs NATO, because ad hoc coalitions are not possible unless you have this day-to-day NATO cooperation. And for the Europeans, even though in the Lisbon Treaty they laid out a plan for much deeper cooperation on foreign and defense policy, The fact is, and this has been demonstrated in spades over the Libya operation, the Europeans still need the NATO involvement as a source of participation in important decisions, influence on U.S. decisions that affect European interests. As you know, the European Union fell apart completely on the whole question of the UN sanctions against Libya, and with Germany, basically Germany abstaining in the UN Security Council vote on the resolution intended to establish the no-fly zone over Libya. The lesson, I think, another lesson for Europe is sometimes this results from my perception that Europeans very often are saying, well, the United States needs to give us more influence, needs to give us more of a say on affairs. My answer to that is when you make larger contributions to security, then you will automatically get more influence. And I think we are seeing that to some extent over Libya. The Europeans are taking more responsibility, and they're getting more say on exactly how the mission is conducted. But then my bottom line lesson is, and this is something I've been arguing for several years now, it is now becoming more acceptable to make this argument that we need to put together more effectively the military and the non-military, the hard power and the soft power instruments that we have. We need to do it on a multilateral basis. We need to do it in cooperation with our allies. And we have not been able to do that effectively so far. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. After the Bush administration, obviously, we came into a honeymoon period in the U.S.-European relationship. President Obama seemed to recognize the importance of the alliance more than the Bush administration did. And the Obama administration started out by taking a number of positions that the Europeans were pleased with. The honeymoons, as you know, don't last forever, and this one didn't last forever. We've gotten into dealing with the nitty-gritties and the difficulties in the relationship. There was one other factor that was helpful, and that is that after many, many years of France being outside of NATO's integrated command structure, President Sarkozy brought France back into the integrated structure a couple of years ago. This makes it a lot easier for our militaries to work together, even though they had worked up all kinds of workarounds. It's just a lot neater now to have France back in the integrated command structure. And it also sends a signal that France has accepted that, in fact, the transatlantic side of their security is important, and they can't just put all of their effort into developing European capabilities or European cooperation. So it was an important part of the honeymoon. Unfortunately, however, this didn't necessarily produce every great result that we would have liked. This is, again, a cartoon showing Europe saying no to George Bush when he asked for more European troops in Afghanistan. And then you see a very loving, friendly Europe also saying no to President Obama. Again, capturing one of the political realities. Now, I told you earlier about the fact that NATO had held a summit last November in Lisbon and agreed on a new strategic concept. Here are all of our 28 leaders of NATO at Lisbon. And in this new strategic concept, they did a number of things. They had to start out by confirming that NATO was still a preeminent forum for security discussions among the allies. They reaffirmed the importance of collective defense as their core mission. They affirmed NATO's role in this crisis management function as well. By the way, on this one, what's so significant about this is that in 1999, the last time they produced a strategic concept, the Europeans absolutely would not agree to any suggestion that NATO was relevant to security beyond Europe's borders. That has totally gone by the wayside. And for people who say, well, this new strategic concept didn't do anything dramatically new, the fact is these exercises never do. What these exercises do is to capture the contemporary reality. And the reality on this point is very different from the last one. And so even though this didn't push the consensus ahead, it captured the new consensus that NATO, in fact, is relevant to security challenges beyond Europe. And obviously, Afghanistan is the most dramatic example of that, but now we also have Libya, piracy, lots of other things that illustrate the challenges to the security and interests of the Allies sometimes don't originate in Europe. For the most part, don't originate in Europe nowadays. NATO also said that it remains a nuclear alliance, and I will conclude with a very brief comment on what that means. The Allies also support cooperation on a whole range of other security areas, including missile defense, cybersecurity, non-proliferation, disarmament, and so forth. And finally, not finally, one more point after this, NATO acknowledged the importance of the United Nations and also the European Union's contributions to security, and reaffirmed the importance of cooperation with Russia. So quite a bit was packed in to this new strategic concept. And the interesting thing that I suggested earlier about how Articles 4 and 5 of the treaty came into play, basically the definition in the strategic concept of collective defense now conflates the terms of Articles 4 and 5. And you'll see here at the beginning of this is taken directly out of the strategic concept, they call it, they printed up a little blue book. And, but they say that NATO does provide defense against an attack. Here you are, it's Article 5. But then they also say that NATO will deter and defend against any threat of aggression and against emerging security challenges. And that's all Article 4. That doesn't come out of Article 5 at all. So collective defense now has been redefined as meaning both defense against an attack, if a country or non-state actor should attack NATO, and secondly against threats, which now is what we mainly are dealing with, particularly in the area of terrorism. Crisis management. Again, this is self-explanatory. NATO said that it is uniquely capable to help manage crises, and they are fortunately very wise. The head of state, or the people who wrote this for them, made the point that NATO can be relevant in a pre-conflict scenario where the allies can play a role in trying to resolve differences among countries and perhaps prevent conflict. The allies can also be helpful using force to try to stop ongoing conflicts, and then very importantly to try to consolidate stability in post-conflict situations. So that is basically a description of a comprehensive approach. NATO trying to deal with conflicts before they emerge, conflicts when they happen, and in a post-conflict environment. And finally, the third core mission, the Allies described as being cooperative security. This is different from cooperative defense, which I talked about earlier. Cooperative security means promoting in a whole variety of ways cooperation with other countries, both in Europe and around the world, and that this is accepted as an important mission of the alliance. This in some ways harks back to Article 2 of the treaty, the Canadian article, but it also makes note of the fact that the door to membership in the alliance remains open to countries that would like to join, European countries that would like to join, and that are qualified, that meet the standards. Now, there are unresolved issues. Two questions remain unresolved. The first was the fact that NATO and the European Union have not been working well together. And if you're going to have a comprehensive concept, you need both the European Union and NATO working together. And the fact is that if you don't have that, you don't get the comprehensive concept, or at least you don't get it working well. The European Union plays an incredibly important part in security in Europe, and it's played an increasingly large role in recent years. But there are limits, and we saw those limits very clearly during the Libya case, where Britain and France went very dramatically in one direction, calling for the use of force against Gaddafi, and Germany went exactly in the opposite direction. And so my argument would be that we have to be realistic about this. Sometimes the Europeans build up their image of what they're doing in their common security and defense policy, and we should be, I think, a little bit skeptical about some of the most exaggerated claims that they make. We should recognize that in some cases We'll have to deal with the members of the European Union as individual nation states, because that's how they make their decisions. We'll have to deal with them through NATO. And when they do have common positions in the European Union, we'll deal with the European Union and we'll deal with those common positions. But it's going to remain that way, I would suggest, for quite a few years, because in the case of the European Union, I don't think that they can have a true, united, integrated common security and defense policy until they have a common united state. And they may get there someday, but they're a long way, I would say, at least decades from there, if they will ever get there. You can't put the cart in front of the horse, the cart being the defense cooperation. It can only go so far as long as the nation states, members of the European Union, believe in maintaining their own perspectives on security issues. Another great cartoon, here you see supposedly Gaddafi with in front of a map of Europe and saying that this is a primitive tribal society. All tribal chiefs are pursuing their own interest. Well, in some ways it's still true about Europe. And I thought that that was, again, a very effective cartoon making the point that I think we need to understand. That we talk about Europe sometimes, sometimes saying Europe thinks this, Europe thinks that. There isn't any such thing most of the time as Europe. There's still a lot of individual nation states. And there are limitations on using the United Nations Security Council. Again, an excellent cartoon showing Russia and China saying that they condemn Libya using force against his own people, but then they reject foreign intervention into a nation's internal affairs because you never know when the occasional heinous crime, despicable act might come in handy. And that's a kind of a brutal way of putting it, but the fact is the UN Security Council is limited by the choices that the Chinese and the Russians make, largely because of their own internal problems and their own internal management of their governments. So NATO is necessary but not sufficient. I put in the book that Mario talked about that it has now become a consensus that we need to have comprehensive approaches to security, and Afghanistan's made it very clear that we need to do that, and that the NATO strategic concept even accepts that we need to do that. We need to meet emerging challenges with a variety of responses, not just military force. We need to put together concepts of how to use diplomacy, military planning, intelligence, development assistance, all of the things that are available to us to try to deal with security challenges. But the attempts to do this have met with great difficulty. I mentioned that NATO and the European Union don't work effectively together. They have not worked well together in Afghanistan, unfortunately. The European Union was very reluctant to play a large role in Afghanistan because they were concerned about becoming subordinated to NATO, which was in charge of the International Security Assistance Force. And in Brussels, the consultations that should take place between NATO and the European Union, they've agreed to talk together about security problems, but in fact they can only talk about Bosnia-Herzegovina. Why? Because there are differences between the Greek and Cypriot governments, members of NATO, and the Turkish government, member of NATO, but not member of the EU. And they are at a deadlock, and therefore there can be no discussions between NATO and the EU about security issues other than Bosnia-Herzegovina. And it gets even more complicated because UN agencies and other international organizations have a hard time sometimes figuring out how to relate to NATO. They don't want to be seen as part of a war effort, but they also need NATO's protection. But it makes for an awkward, difficult relationship. I said I would say a concluding word about the NATO issue, the NATO nuclear strategy issue. I was in Tallinn, Estonia 2 weeks ago now. I was asked to give a talk on the political conditions that would affect NATO nuclear deterrence strategy. All of the other discussions were about the various elements of that strategy. And the point that I tried to make was that even if they came up with the very best deterrence strategy in terms of concepts that are good on paper, in terms of forces that were capable of deterrence, that in fact the backbone of NATO deterrence was the feeling among NATO countries that they had a consensus about their common interests, common values that they were supporting, and that in fact those people that we wanted to deter would not be deterred if they perceived that NATO was not acting as a unified body. And so the politics of the relationship is very important, and the deeds are very important. For example, the fact that there was not agreement between allies about how to deal with Libya, that Germany went its own way, certainly created a weak perception of both the European Union and also of the alliance. So, what have I said? I said that I think that the values and interests shared by the NATO allies make it a continuing relevance and importance, that in recent years the alliance has survived at least one crisis, maybe actually a few more than one, that the NATO-EU relationship in the future is going to be very important. It has to be improved. The new strategic concept that made some serious progress in redefining, or at least in updating, the way the NATO allies see the role of the alliance in the world. And the United States and its allies need to find ways to better coordinate non-military and military instruments of national policy. And so that is the end of my talk. There's my book rotating, and I look forward to your questions and comments. By the way, if you want to make a comment at the beginning of your question, it's a very traditional thing to do, so please feel free to do that. Thank you.
All right, we have this table over here. Peter, we need to pay attention to Mark.
This question is, does the Libya crisis legitimately fall within the domain of NATO as a threat to one or more member states? Or are we using it to press for increased democracy in the Arab Spring? Can you share your thoughts on this subject?
It's a great question, and I think probably the question already includes a good part of the answer. I don't think that Libya posed a direct threat to any NATO country. It certainly was perceived as a threat to stability in the region. And you have to remember, it's the French and the British governments that got out in the lead on this one and sort of pulled the United States along. The Obama administration was at first reluctant, but I think the value argument and the making a stand against a dictator that obviously was a vile character and already had instigated the Lockerbie incident and so forth. So I think there was a perception that Gaddafi, at least in the past, had been a threat to the interests of NATO countries, and Lockerbie was the main example. But of course the edge was taken off from that by the fact that Gaddafi had been more or less behaving himself in recent years. I think in some ways it was, I hate to say this, but in some ways there is a similarity in one aspect to the Bush administration decision to go into Iraq. And that is that I think that France and Great Britain thought, and the United States maybe as well, thought that it wouldn't be that hard to go in and use our capabilities to basically get Gaddafi out. Even though the UN resolution didn't go that far, obviously, the objectives of the US, the UK, and France obviously did go that far. That was what we wanted to do. I thought we could, I think that the administration and the allies thought, we can do this. It won't be that difficult. And that was one of the flaws of the Iraq plan of the Bush administration. They thought they could go into Iraq, defeat Saddam Hussein, and get rid of him and leave. And that obviously didn't turn out to be the case. But I think that was a mistaken assumption in both cases. I don't think the Libya case will be as costly or dramatic as Iraq was. Iraq obviously was very costly in so many ways. And I don't think Libya will be that costly. But I do think there was a feeling that we can do this, we can get rid of a vile dictator in the region, we can add perhaps some momentum to the awakening, the Arab awakening or the Arab Spring. And it's obviously turned out to be more difficult than we thought, than the governments thought. But there we are. Good question.
Russia was hardly mentioned in the presentation, quite possibly a reflection of current state of affairs, but it was a raison d'etre for the organization. Could you speak a little bit about the current situation, NATO's perspective on Russia and vice versa?
Since the end of the Cold War, there have been a variety of different perspectives inside NATO about how to deal with Russia. There was a lot of interest in the early 1990s in trying to bring Russia into a cooperative relationship with the alliance. There were a lot of steps taken in the 90s and after to develop that relationship. There were those, even in the early 1990s, I remember Jesse Helms, when during a hearing on NATO enlargement, being very suspicious and questioning Madeleine Albright, then Secretary of State, about, are we really going to have the possibility of Russia becoming a member of NATO? And he obviously thought that was a really silly idea, and one that he opposed strongly, and she answered it very diplomatically at the time. But the complexity grew even more when former members of the Warsaw Pact became members of NATO, and particularly when the Baltic states became members of NATO. When Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were admitted to the alliance, they brought with them a very recent experience of being totally dominated by Russia. And that was the motivation for their wanting to be in the alliance. And so today we have those countries, Germany perhaps leading among them, who believe that Germany has a lot of mutual economic interest, energy supply interest with Russia, and it's a growing economic relationship and a growing feeling of trust between Russia and Germany. That trust does not translate into the attitudes of many other NATO countries, and particularly the ones on the front lines, the Baltic states, and also in Poland as well, and to a lesser extent in the Czech Republic and some of the other former Warsaw Pact states. But the fact is that there are very different attitudes in the alliance about how to deal with Russia. Everybody has agreed that NATO should put out the hand of cooperation and hope that Russia will grasp it. And that's been pretty much the consistent policy of the alliance since the end of the Cold War. Right. Has it worked? Well, only partially. And to some extent, some people would argue that the process of enlarging NATO, bringing in these countries, was seen as an aggressive move by the West and it was counter to Russian interests. I personally have to say I've always felt that, knowing NATO as I do, I knew that what we weren't making an alliance that was more capable of attacking Russia or doing bad things to Russian interests. Though I always had some suspicion about Russian motivations in complaining quite so vociferously as they did. And even in the early 1990s, it was my theory that in fact there were real dangers that Russia itself might fall apart. And Chechnya was perhaps could be the beginning of a crumbling of Russia altogether once the Soviet Union gone. And that Russia would therefore go through a period of increased authoritarian rule once it got over this dramatic period of the 1990s when capitalism of a very sort of criminal kind went rampant. And I thought probably we would see an authoritarian period again in Russia, trying to hold the country together. I think that's where we are right now. And the reality is that authoritarian regimes always benefit from having an external enemy that they can focus on. I think NATO has served as a convenient external enemy that they can pull out from time to time when they need to show the Russian people that the Russian people need to continue to support this kind of authoritarian regime coming out of Moscow. So I think a lot of Russia's attitude toward NATO is driven by internal political requirements, and that the only way that this will change in the long run is hopefully if the Russian leadership starts to feel more confident about being able to hold Russia together even with a more open political system, that then will translate into a more open attitude toward cooperation with NATO. But that's my It's just my analysis, and so I'm hopeful that in the long run the relationship can continue to improve. I strongly support the idea of offering the hand of friendship on a constant basis, and knowing that Russia won't always take it, and Russia won't be ready to take it because it doesn't serve their interests all the time.
Thank you.
Yes. Does NATO have a role to play? Should it have a role to play in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
It's a great question, because in fact for one of my Middlebury classes I use that as a role-playing. I do a role-playing exercise with my Middlebury students every year, and I use that case, and that NATO had been asked to provide a peacekeeping force. There had been a settlement reached between Israel and Palestinians, and NATO was being asked to help enforce that peace. And it made a great role-playing exercise because of the dynamics. Of course, the problem here is that the prospects for a peace settlement still are so remote that very few in NATO would even think that that was something that they should be worrying about right now. Very few countries in the alliance would, at this point, support getting involved in that situation. However, if there were a settlement, if there were an actual settlement, an agreement, there I think would be a lot more support inside the alliance for helping to make that work. And I think that if the Palestinians and the Israelis wanted NATO to be involved, there would be support in NATO for doing that, because this would be such a dramatic development and such an unexpected one, unfortunately.
We have really three related questions that relate to the history of NATO. What would have happened that would have changed things if France had joined the European defense community instead of staying out of it? Wasn't the Cold War won because the Soviet economy fell apart? And before it fell apart, was it not the American atomic arsenal that deterred the Soviet Union from attacking Western Europe? And would not both of these have happened without the need for the existence of NATO?
Good one.
Let's start with the what if France had been able to approve the European defense community. It then would have created a more balanced relationship between the United States and Europe. It just wasn't going to happen, obviously, because the French were so concerned about not being able to balance German power in a European defense community. And the French perception was that as soon as they agreed to the European defense community and got it set up, that the United States would withdraw. And in that case, I think you would end up with a very different scenario. It would not necessarily have been as good a one for Europe as the scenario that we saw with the United States being constantly involved in European defense. As costly and as lengthy as it was, the end result probably was worth it, in my view. And so maybe the French did everybody a favor by not approving the European defense community. I don't know. It's possible. I'm not sure that I mean, the United States made serious contributions to all of that falling apart. The United States, the Eisenhower administration, took a new look at the strategy and went to heavy reliance on nuclear weapons for our own defense, for austerity reasons. The Eisenhower administration, John Foster Dulles went to NATO, told NATO that the United States was going to rely heavily on nuclear weapons for its own defense, and therefore the NATO defense would rely heavily on nuclear weapons. That sort of gave the Europeans a ticket to escape from putting anything very solid together in the form of conventional defense. Now, conventional defense, the Germans played a huge role during the Cold War. They provided a lot of the frontline troops. That had there been a war, the Germans would have been very directly and deeply involved, as would have we. But it's hard to go back and say, what if? The what ifs don't necessarily lead you anywhere. And I've always had a problem. Everybody has a problem with what ifs. And I think under the circumstances, we ended up with an outcome that wasn't too bad, and that it was certainly within our interests in the long run. And I'm not sure how things would have gone with another kind of structure of relations. The point I try to make is that the way that the alliance ended up being constructed, it was guaranteed that we would have a burden-sharing issue, that the United States would be unhappy with having to spend so much money on this alliance, and the Europeans would become increasingly dependent on that American effort. And this leads also to a little theory that I have, is that burden sharing is always going to be a problem in an alliance of democracies. Now, NATO is the prime example that we have, but in an alliance of democracies, the democratic leadership of each country feels a responsibility to their people, to their citizens, to get the most security for the lowest price, right? That's what everybody wants. Well, if everybody in an alliance is doing that, then you're going to have a burden sharing problem, because everybody's going to want to shift burdens to somebody else in the alliance. And so burden sharing is an inevitable result, a consequence of democracies forming an alliance and deciding to cooperate. It will always be a problem, whether it's a little bit easier when economies are growing, when there's periods of economic growth, much more difficult when you're in a recession, difficult when your economy is not growing.
So I've compounded it this way. How is NATO funded? And that's just a small question. But were we to take Libya, the motives for involvement in Libya face humanitarian value. How far do you think NATO may be willing to go going forward in terms of solving the problems of failed states, pending massacres and things like that? How is NATO funded? How far is it willing to go in the future?
The funding issue is fairly straightforward. The budgets of the alliance are paid on a sharing formula that is determined according to population and GDP, basically. The U.S. share someplace around 23%, I believe. It gets adjusted over time, and the shares of European countries have been increased over time. However, that budget is almost irrelevant, because that's not where the money is spent. The money is spent in defense budgets. So the main contributions of allies are made with their defense spending.
Yeah.
And in that case, the United States grossly outspends everybody in the alliance and in the rest of the world. And of course, from a NATO point of view, not all of that, not nearly all of that, is NATO-related spending. I don't know whether, I don't think it is broken down that way. U.S. defense spending is not broken down, because it's hard to apportion what parts of the American defense structure actually could be relevant to NATO. Sometimes they'd be relevant, sometimes not. And so the important thing is defense spending. The budgets are on a formula that provide for the running of the headquarters and so forth. The Libya case is going to be another example, perhaps, of a learning experience for the alliance to try to figure out what could have been done better, what succeeded and what failed. And we still, at this point, it's hard to say. We don't know whether there has been more or less of a success in maintaining the terms of the UN resolution. But in terms of removing Gaddafi, the story hasn't come to an end yet. It's a little bit like the cartoon with Uncle Sam shooting the bullet through everybody missing Saddam Hussein. Well, right now, there have been a lot of bullets shot, but we don't have the end of the story yet. It will be a learning experience, just as Afghanistan is going to be a learning experience. There were times a few years ago when people said, a lot of experts wrote, that Afghanistan was going to be, was going to be an existential issue for the alliance. If Afghanistan was a failure, then the alliance was a failure. I think people don't talk this way any longer. They understand that the main reason for all the problems in Afghanistan is the fact the United States didn't really put a high priority on it through most of the time that we were engaged in Iraq. And we went in, and then we basically didn't pay attention to it for almost a decade. And that's the main reason why we've got all the problems that we've got. There are things to learn about NATO. NATO obviously had the problem of individual countries having all kinds of what were called caveats, and caveats have been reduced, but they still exist, on what they'll do and what they won't do as part of the exercise. So the Germans took the air role in the northern part of Afghanistan, where previously it was relatively quiet. There's been more Taliban activity up there recently, but basically countries all said what they were willing to do and what they weren't willing to do, and that's what led to the cartoon that I have about the Canadians being on the front line and taking a lot of casualties. Very high level of casualties were taken by Canadian troops when they were in a combat role. So Libya is going to be another learning experience. One thing that, I don't know if you saw the headline maybe about a month ago now, there was a big headline that said the Allies are running out of munitions to use against Libyan targets. And I haven't seen that headline since, which it's interesting. I mean, it's not a surprise how many NATO countries figured they're going to get involved in this kind of an operation. They're going to have to try to figure out, are we going to do something like this again? We better build up our ammunition stocks. Some of the ammunition the French were using, they didn't have any open production lines, for example, and they weren't able to use stuff coming off American production lines because they had made, they weren't interoperable. They weren't, couldn't put them on French aircraft or deliver them. And this is another, this was a little bit of the French being French. We're going to be different. We're going to be unique. We're going to be sovereign. But it makes it more difficult in this case, where the United States could be providing munitions to them, but they can't use them. Now, maybe they've developed some workarounds. I haven't seen any more reports of the Allies being short on bombs and missiles. But in any case, I don't know the answer, the long-term answer to your question. I think both experiences in Afghanistan and Libya will raise questions about whether NATO has been effective, but when it comes down to it, other than ad hoc coalitions led by the United States, it's the only option. If the international community wants an effective military intervention, NATO is the only multilateral option. There is no UN option. There is no European Union option for something this complex. I know from previous studies I've been engaged in that neither the UK nor France are capable of providing the infrastructure for such a large operation. It's only NATO that can do it, or the US. Those are the two, and not forgetting that, which sometimes people forget, that NATO is also the US. And sometimes I say to audiences that I'm rambling on here a bit, but I want to make this point. A lot of times we in the United States think about NATO as those damn Europeans. When the Europeans think about NATO as those damn Americans. The fact is, it's both the damn Americans and the damn Europeans. It's a place to make us work.
What would you suggest the first step should be to improve relations between NATO and the European Union? Are there specific things you can mention that one or the other of those two parties might do?
I think at this point, the most important problem is the fact that Turkey on the one hand, Greece and Cyprus on the other, cannot agree on terms. And Turkey knows that there are a lot of people in the European Union that will never let, a lot of countries that would never let Turkey into the European Union, even though Turkey is going down the road toward membership. Turkey knows, and anyone who's realistic knows, there's a big wall at some point on that road, and the Turks are never going to make it through it. They're too big, they're too Muslim, they're too lots of things for the other Europeans. I think in the United States policy has been to try to promote Turkish membership in the EU. U.S. administrations for several years now, probably three administrations, have followed the same approach in encouraging the EU to let Turkey into the organization. I think one important step might be working with the Turks to and working with the European Union to try to come up with some alternative to membership in the European Union that nonetheless would give them an important and significant role in the relationship with the European Union. Now, tricky doing this because you don't want to push Turkey over into playing sort of a neutral role in that region. We want to keep Turkey on the side of the West, the Alliance, of Europe, of the Atlantic community, and we need to ensure that that happens. But I think that may be the only area to work with. The European Union made a huge mistake several years ago when they allowed Cyprus into the alliance without insisting on some kind of deal with Turkey. They didn't. They brought Cyprus in without insisting on any terms, and therefore now you not only have bankrupt Greece against Turkey, but you also have Cyprus against Turkey. And this is really the heart of the problem. It has a little bit to do with differences between bureaucrats in the EU who don't want to work closely with NATO. There is some in the EU Commission in Brussels. I think there's a bias against NATO, and to some extent perhaps in the NATO bureaucracy. But the real big problem is this relationship with Turkey. So I think we need some creative thinking about how to get beyond that. And it's going to take different positions from us, from the EU, from Greece, and from Cyprus, and from Turkey.
Thank you very much. It's a